The fire should not have existed. That was the thought that pulled Nora Ashfield back from the edge of unconsciousness, not the warmth itself, though it was a mercy so profound she almost wept from it, but the impossibility of it. She had fallen asleep in a dead wagon on a dead road somewhere between Laramie and nowhere, the canvas cover doing nothing against the Wyoming winter that had descended like a punishment from a god she had long since stopped praying to. She had pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her mother's quilt around her shoulders and accepted, with the particular clarity that comes only when a person has run out of options, that she might not wake up, but she had woken up, and there was fire. She lay still for a long, careful moment, the kind of stillness that a woman alone learns quickly and learns permanently. The flames were small but deliberate, built in the space between the wagon's open back and the ground, arranged in the specific way that someone who understood fire had arranged them, not too close to the wagon's dry wood, not exposed enough to the wind that was still cutting across the open plain. Someone had thought about it. Someone had done it without waking her. She sat up slowly. The quilt fell from her shoulders. The cold tried to reclaim her immediately, but the fire pushed back, and she turned toward the sound she had already heard without letting herself hear it. The quiet, rhythmic sound of a man sharpening a knife. He was sitting on a rock about 10 feet from the fire, his back mostly to her, his coat dark and heavy and worn in the particular way that garments worn every single day for years develop a kind of personality of their own. He had not looked up. He was working the blade against the whetstone with a patience that seemed to belong to a different century, slow and even and utterly without urgency. She stared at him. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hand found the small revolver she kept beneath the quilt, the one her late husband had pressed into her palm 6 months ago in a moment of terrible foresight, the one she had not known how to fire until the week after his funeral, when she had spent an afternoon behind a barn in Kansas learning. The man still did not look up. "You can put the gun down," he said. His voice was low and even with the particular flatness of someone who had spent a great deal of time alone. "I built the fire and kept walking. I came back to check the fire. That is all." She did not put the gun down. "Who are you?" He stopped sharpening the knife. He set the whetstone in his coat pocket and sheathed the blade with a single practiced motion, and then he turned and looked at her for the first time. And Nora Ashfield understood immediately and completely that this man carried a dark past the way other men carried pocket watches, close to the body, always present, rarely shown. His name, she would learn later, was Preston Kirby, and this was only the beginning of the most terrifying, consuming, forbidden thing that had ever happened to either of them. 6 months before that Wyoming night, Nora had been a wife. It was strange how completely that identity had defined her, and how completely it had been erased. One morning she was Mrs. Nora Ashfield of Abilene, Kansas, wife of Daniel Ashfield, schoolteacher and quiet man, a man who loved books and hated confrontation, and had, in his gentle and unremarkable way, built a life with her that was small and warm and sufficient. And then, Daniel had gone to the general store on a Tuesday in late April of 1878 and had come home with a cough, and the cough had become a fever, and the fever had become something the doctor called consumption, and spoke about in hushed tones, as though the word itself might spread. By July, Daniel was gone. He left her the house, which had a mortgage she could not pay. He left her the wagon and the 2 horses, one of whom died in August. He left her his books, which she kept even when she sold everything else, because they smelled like him, and she was not ready to stop smelling him yet. And he left her a letter, written in his careful schoolteacher's hand, that told her his brother in Wyoming had land and a house, and that she should go there, that Thomas would help her start again. She had sold the house in September, packed what she could into the wagon, and started north and west with a single horse, and a determination that she had since come to understand was not courage but desperation wearing courage's clothes. She had made it as far as a town called Ridge Creek, Wyoming, when the horse died. That was the hidden injustice of being a widow alone in 1878, not the grief, which was real and enormous, but the sheer mechanical collapse of everything that had depended on a second person to function. A horse costs money. A new horse costs more money than she had. A freight service costs money. Everything costs money, and money, as it turned out, was the one thing Daniel Ashfield's quiet life had not managed to accumulate. She had sat in that wagon on a frozen road 3 miles outside Ridge Creek for 2 days, waiting for another traveler to pass, watching the temperature drop, and the sky go the particular shade of gray that means snow before morning. And she had thought very clearly and very calmly that she was going to die out here. Not in a dramatic way. In the quiet, cold, anonymous way that people died all the time in this country, people whose names were not recorded and whose stories were not told. Then Preston Kirby had ridden past on a gray horse and had not stopped, had not so much as looked at the wagon. And then, 20 minutes later, he had come back. Preston Kirby was 31 years old in the winter of 1878, though he would not have been able to tell you that with any certainty, because he had long since stopped keeping track of years the way a man stops keeping track of a debt he knows he cannot repay. He had been born in Missouri to a father who drank and a mother who prayed, and those two forces had pulled him in directions that had eventually, inevitably, sent him west. He had been a cowhand at 17, a cattle driver at 19, a man who had done things at 22 that he did not let himself think about in the daylight hours. He had spent the last 4 years as what the classified advertisements in Western newspapers called a range detective, and what most honest men called a gun for hire. He hunted men who needed to be found, and he found them, and what happened after the finding depended on who had hired him and what they had paid for. He was not proud of all of it. He was not particularly ashamed of all of it either, which was perhaps the more honest confession. He drifted. That was the simplest way to describe it. Town to town, job to job, the same gray horse and the same dark coat, and the same flat expression that told people what they needed to know about him quickly enough that most of them gave him a wide berth. He ate alone, slept alone, and spoke to people only when it was necessary. He did not know, riding past that wagon in the gathering dark, why he turned around. He told himself it was habit. That a man who had spent years reading landscapes and situations, the way other men read newspapers, could not simply ride past a wagon sitting alone on a road in winter without his instincts pulling at him. He told himself it was practical, a dead horse, an abandoned wagon, potential trouble down the road if he ignored it. He told himself a lot of things in the 20 minutes between passing the wagon and turning the gray horse around. When he rode back, he dismounted quietly and walked to the wagon and looked inside and found a woman asleep. She was curled on her side with a quilt pulled around her shoulders and her dark hair loose against the worn wood of the wagon bed, and she was breathing in the shallow, irregular way of someone whose body temperature was already dangerously low. The dead horse was still in the traces, stiff now. The wagon itself was offering no real shelter. The canvas was ripped on one side and the wind was moving through freely. Preston stood there for a moment in the dark and the cold, and looked at this woman he did not know and felt something shift in his chest that he could not name and did not try to. He gathered wood from the scrub along the road, dry enough to catch. He built the fire between the back of the wagon and a natural windbreak of rock, placing it carefully, precisely, as far from the dry wagon boards as safety required and as close as warmth demanded. He fed it until it was stable and self-sustaining. He checked on the woman, who had not moved, whose color was better already in the orange glow. He sat down on the rock with his whetstone and his knife and did not speak and did not leave. That was the thing he had not been able to explain to himself afterward, for a very long time. He had done what needed doing, and then he had stayed, which was not the same thing as doing what needed doing. Staying was something else entirely. When she asked him who he was, he turned and looked at her for the first time properly, and he said his name because there did not seem to be a reason not to. "Preston Kirby," he said. "I am heading toward Laramie." Nora looked at him for a long time with the revolver still in her hand. She was trying to read him the way a person tries to read weather, not always successfully, but usually accurately enough to survive. What she saw was a man who was tired in a way that sleep did not fix, with dark eyes that had seen too much and hands that were steady in the manner of someone who had trained them to be steady, rather than someone who had come by stillness naturally. He was not handsome in any easy, comfortable way. He was something more complicated than handsome. "My horse died," she said, "because it seemed important to establish the basics. I can see that. I am trying to reach my brother-in-law's property outside Laramie, Thomas Ashfield." Preston was quiet for a moment. "You are about 40 miles south of Laramie." "Yes," Nora said. "I am aware." The faintest thing crossed his face, something that might have been the beginning of something else before he suppressed it. "I will take the horse out of the traces in the morning. There are people in Ridge Creek who will buy the wagon." Nora put the revolver down, not because she had fully decided to trust him, but because she had decided that he was the kind of man who would have done something by now if he was going to do something. "What are you going to do tonight?" "Keep the fire going," he said simply, and turned back to his whetstone. She watched him for a while, wrapped in her quilt, and the fire was warm and steady, and she eventually lay back down and closed her eyes and thought that this was either the safest she had been in 6 months or the most elaborate trap she had ever walked into. She woke in the morning to bright cold sunshine and a fire that had been carefully banked and was still producing heat. And Preston Kirby was unhitching the dead horse from the traces with the efficient, unhurried movements of a man who had done physical work his whole life. He did not look at her when she climbed out of the wagon. She stood in the cold morning and looked at the fire and the horse and the vast flat Wyoming plain that stretched in every direction like a promise or a threat, depending on how you looked at it. And she made a decision that would change both their lives, though she did not know it yet. "I will pay you," she said, "to take me to Thomas Ashfield's property." Preston stopped working. He straightened up and looked at her over the horse's back. "I told you I am heading toward Laramie. I know. I am asking you to take a passenger." Another long pause, and in the pauses of Preston Kirby's silences you could, if you were paying attention, see him thinking, not the quick, surface thinking of most conversations, but something deeper and more reluctant. As though his conclusions were things he had to dig up from somewhere, they had been deliberately buried. "What can you pay?" he asked. She told him the honest number, which was not large. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to refuse. Then he nodded once, the single definitive nod of a man who has made a decision and will not revisit it. "We leave in 1 hour," he said. It was 3 days' ride to Thomas Ashfield's property, under good conditions. These were not particularly good conditions. The Wyoming winter of 1878 was already proving itself to be exceptionally harsh, And the second day brought a snowstorm that was not blizzard strength, but was unpleasant enough to slow their progress significantly. Preston rode ahead, and Nora rode behind him on a horse he had rented in Ridge Creek before they left. A sturdy, bad-tempered roan that she had to manage with both hands and most of her concentration, which was, she came to think, not entirely accidental on Preston's part. Keeping her occupied kept her from talking too much. He was not, it became apparent within the first few hours, a conversational man. She tried, because silence of the kind that followed Preston Kirby around was not comfortable silence. It was the silence of something not being said, and Nora Ashfield had always preferred to know what was not being said even when it was uncomfortable. "Where are you from originally?" she asked on the first afternoon, riding close enough to speak over the wind. "Missouri. I am from Ohio originally. We moved to Kansas when I was 16. She waited. He did not ask anything in return. "My father was a farmer. He thought the Kansas soil was better." "Was it?" "Adequate," she said. He managed. More silence. The wind made it feel like conversation was a physical effort, which perhaps it was. "Do you have family?" she asked, because she was genuinely curious, and because she thought that a person who had done someone a significant kindness deserved to be treated as a person rather than a useful service. Preston's answer was very slow in coming. Not anymore. She did not push it. She filed it under the growing catalog of things about him that she suspected were connected to the dark, heavy quality he carried. The sense that underneath the flat exterior there were rooms that had been locked a long time ago for reasons that were probably very good reasons. That evening they made camp near a stand of cottonwoods that provided some shelter from the wind, and Preston built another fire, again with the same quiet competence, the same deliberate attention to placement and structure, and heated water for coffee, which he had in a tin in his saddlebag along with dried meat and hardtack. He offered it to her without being asked and without ceremony, and she accepted it with the straightforward gratitude of someone who had stopped being proud about accepting help. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, and the distance between them felt both safe and oddly regrettable. And Nora caught herself studying him in the way she had been trying not to do all day, the way that felt like a betrayal of something, of Daniel, of propriety, of her own insistence that she was not that kind of woman. But she was curious about him in a way that went past simple social interest, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that curiosity for what it was becoming. "Why did you come back?" she asked. He looked up from the fire. He had a tin cup in his hands, and he was not drinking from it, just holding it. "What do you mean? You rode past. I heard you, then you came back." She held his gaze, which required more effort than she had expected because his eyes were not easy eyes to hold. They were the kind of eyes that gave nothing away and took everything in, and looking into them felt exposing. "Why?" The fire snapped between them. Preston looked back down at his cup. "It was cold," he said, which was not an answer, and they both knew it. On the second day, with the snow coming down in earnest, Nora's roan slipped on an icy section of track, and she nearly went over its head before Preston was suddenly there, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his horse against her leg, his hand steady on the roan's bridle, holding them both still while the animal found its feet. His face was very close to hers for a moment. She could see the particular way the cold had reddened his jaw above the scruff of dark beard, and she could see something in his expression that he had not been careful enough to remove before she looked, something that was not concern exactly, but was adjacent to it, something much more personal than the impersonal helpfulness he had maintained since the beginning. He backed his horse away immediately when the roan was steady. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and rode ahead, and neither of them mentioned it. But things had shifted, the way things shift after a moment of unguarded truth, and the silence between them for the rest of that afternoon was a different kind of silence, charged and searching, full of things that had not been said and were pressing harder against the inside of the moment. That evening's camp was forced by the snow into the shelter of a low ravine, and the space was smaller and the fire, of necessity, was closer to where they were sitting, and the closeness meant that conversation, when it finally came differently. Less formally. More carefully. "You said your husband's brother," Preston said, which was the first time he had initiated conversation, and she felt the surprise of it like something physical. "What happened to your husband?" "Consumption," she said. "In July." "I am sorry." "So am I." She turned her cup in her hands. "Daniel was a good man, a quiet man. He taught school and read to me in the evenings and never raised his voice in his life." She paused. "I miss him very much, but I also miss who I was when he was alive, if that makes sense. I miss having a shape, a place in the world." She had not intended to say that last part. It felt dangerously honest. But Preston was looking at the fire and nodding slowly, the way a person nods when they recognize something from personal experience. "Yes," he said. "It makes sense." She looked at him. "Have you lost someone?" The firelight moved across his face, and the pause was long enough that she thought he had decided not to answer. "My brother," he said finally. 4 years ago." "What happened?" Another pause, this one longer. She could see him making a decision. "He was killed. By a man I was working with. A man I had trusted." He stopped, started again. "I was supposed to protect him. I did not." The weight of that sentence was so heavy she could almost feel it pressing the air down between them. "That was not your fault," she said, his jaw tightened. "You do not know the specifics." "No. But I know what guilt looks like on a person." She said it gently, not as an accusation. "You have been carrying it a long time." He did not respond to that. He put his cup down and adjusted the fire with a stick, and then sat back with his arms resting on his knees and his gaze fixed somewhere past the flames. And Nora watched him and felt something turn over slowly inside her chest, the specific ache of recognizing a wounded thing. They arrived at Thomas Ashfield's property on the afternoon of the third day. Thomas Ashfield was a large man in his early 40s with Daniel's same pale eyes and an expression that suggested the world had been a series of manageable disappointments. He met them at the gate of his property with a combination of relief and wariness that Nora found immediately exhausting, since she had been dealing with wariness for 3 days already, and relief, in Thomas's version, seemed to come with implied obligations attached. But that was later. Right now she needed to thank Preston Kirby. She had his money ready in an envelope, the agreed amount, which she had gotten from selling the wagon in Ridge Creek while he had been renting the horses, and which she counted out again just to be sure, because she was precise about money in the way that people are precise about things they have very little of. She handed it to him, and he took it and looked at it and then looked at her. "This is more than we agreed," he said. "You built a fire that saved my life," she said. "I thought an additional amount was appropriate." He tried to hand the extra back. She put her hands in her pockets. "Preston," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and both of them felt it. "Keep it." He looked at her for a moment with that searching, carefully neutral expression, and then he folded the envelope and put it in his coat pocket. "Mrs. Ashfield," he said, which was the first time he had called her anything. "I hope you find what you are looking for here." She thought about what she was looking for, which was a shape and a place in the world. And she looked at this man she had known for 3 days, who had built her a fire without being asked and ridden through a snowstorm to bring her to safety, and told her exactly one true thing about himself in 72 hours. And she thought that the people you find at the worst moments of your life sometimes have a way of becoming the most important. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." He nodded. He mounted his gray horse. He rode south. She watched until he was gone. Thomas Ashfield's property was a working cattle ranch of modest size, with a main house, a bunkhouse for the 2 hands he employed, and a small structure at the back that had been used for storage and was offered to Nora as her accommodation, with an expression that suggested he expected her to be grateful for the charity. She was. She was also clear-eyed enough about the situation to understand that gratitude and dependence were not the same thing, and that what she needed to do, as soon as possible, was establish a way to contribute that was real and visible and not simply decorative. She offered to cook for the household, which Thomas accepted with more enthusiasm than he had shown about anything else so far. She offered to keep accounts, which she had done for Daniel's school, and which revealed, within the first 2 weeks, that Thomas's bookkeeping was so catastrophic that it took her 3 days to untangle a single month's worth of records. Thomas was embarrassed and then, reluctantly, grateful in a more genuine way. She settled into a routine. She cooked and kept accounts and read in the evenings from Daniel's books, and she found slowly that the shape she had been missing was returning, different in its contours but real in hers. She was practical and capable and competent, and competence, she had always believed, was the most reliable foundation for self-respect. But she thought about Preston Kirby. She tried not to. She told herself it was sentiment, the natural attachment that forms between people who have shared a difficult experience, no different from the warmth she felt for the Ridge Creek stable hand who had helped her rent the roan. She told herself it was loneliness, which was real and pervasive, and made everything feel more significant than it was. She thought about his hands on the bridle when the roan slipped. She thought about the fire that had existed when it should not have existed. She thought about my brother, and I was supposed to protect him, and a silence that went so deep you could feel its bottom. She wrote him a letter in early December, and then did not send it because she did not know where to send it, which answered one question about what she was doing with her feelings and raised several others. In Laramie, Preston had found work. A rancher named Culver Marsh had a problem that required the kind of solution Preston specialized in. 3 months of cattle theft, a systematic and sophisticated operation, and the local sheriff had gotten nowhere because the thieves were local enough to know how to disappear into the landscape and connected enough to have eyes on the sheriff's office. Marsh needed someone who could work without being watched and did not have allegiances to anyone in the county. It was the kind of work Preston had done 100 times. He knew how to move without being seen, and how to gather information without seeming to gather information, and how to put pieces together in the dark before anyone realized the picture was forming. He had done it in Texas and Colorado and Montana, and a dozen territories in between, and he was good at it, the way people are good at things that they had no particular ambition toward but that life had shaped them for anyway. He found 3 of the 4 thieves within 6 weeks. The 4th one was a man named Garrett Hale, who had grown up in Laramie and knew the country around it the way you know a place you have never wanted to leave. Every hidden valley and frozen creek and back road that did not appear on any map. Hale was proving more difficult to locate, which was not yet a problem but was going to become one. Preston worked and ate and slept and did not think about the woman with the dark hair and the wagon on the frozen road, except that he did think about her, constantly and without permission, which was a new and deeply unwelcome experience for a man who had spent 4 years successfully not thinking about anyone. He could not explain it. He had pulled people out of bad situations before. He had been thanked and moved on. He had never built a fire and then stayed and then thought about the fire for 6 weeks afterward. He told himself it was because she had been interesting. Most people were not interesting. Nora Ashfield had been direct and honest and unsentimental in her grief, and she had looked at him with those gray eyes and said, "You have been carrying it a long time," as though she was reading something written in a language she already knew. And he had not expected that, and he had not known what to do with it, and he had ridden south and then spent 6 weeks thinking about it. That was the whole of it. He told himself that until he stopped believing it, which was somewhere around the middle of December. Then Garrett Hale made it necessary to approach Thomas Ashfield's ranch. Preston did not know that Nora Ashfield was living there when he rode out to the ranch on a December morning to ask Thomas Ashfield about the road access on his south pasture, which was one of the routes Hale had been rumored to use for moving cattle. He rode through the gate and tied his horse at the post and knocked at the door of the main house. And the door opened, and Nora Ashfield was standing in it with flour on her hands, and a look of absolute, complete shock on her face that he suspected was mirrored on his own. They stared at each other for a long moment. "Preston Kirby," she said. "Mrs. Ashfield," he said. She looked at him and then at the flour on her hands and then back at him. "What are you doing here?" "I am working," he said. "For Culver Marsh, cattle theft investigation. I need to speak to Thomas Ashfield about access to his south pasture." "Thomas is in Laramie today," she said. "He will be back this evening." Another silence. Nora stepped back from the door, not entirely as an invitation, but not entirely not. "You can come in and wait," she said. "If the matter is important." "It is," he said, which was true. He followed her inside, and she brought him coffee at the kitchen table and sat across from him with her own cup, and they looked at each other across the table in a kitchen that smelled of bread and wood smoke and the winter outside. And the whole situation had the quality of something that was happening because it was supposed to happen, which Preston found profoundly disorienting. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Since November." "Is it working? The arrangement with your brother-in-law?" She considered this. "Well enough," she said. "Thomas is not an easy man, but he is not an unkind one. I earned my place here." She paused. "And you found work in Laramie?" "Yes, with this Marsh person." "Yes," she nodded slowly. "Is it dangerous work?" He thought about Garrett Hale, who was not a violent man by reputation, but who was cornered enough now to become one. "Sometimes," he said. She looked at her coffee cup and then back up at him and said, quietly and directly, "I am glad you are not dead." He did not know what to do with that. He did not answer it. He looked down at his own coffee, and something moved through him that had the quality of an avalanche. Not dramatic, not sudden, but irreversible. A large and silent settling of things into new configurations. Thomas returned that evening and gave Preston the information he needed about the south pasture, and Preston thanked him and stood to leave, and Nora was standing in the kitchen doorway when he passed through the main room. "Come back," she said. "When your work is finished." He looked at her. The firelight from the kitchen was behind her, and she was just a silhouette with light around the edges, and the sentence hung in the air between them with all its possible meanings. "All right," he said. He came back. Not immediately. The work took another 3 weeks, and the 3 weeks were complicated by the fact that Garrett Hale turned out to be, on confrontation, a man who made bad decisions under pressure. Preston found him in the early morning in the ravine he had been using as a holding pen for stolen cattle, and there was a moment of the kind of standoff that Preston had been in enough times to handle, but that he never found routine, where a man has to calculate odds and options very quickly and act on the calculation before the other person does. Hale eventually surrendered, which was the outcome Preston preferred, and had managed to engineer through a combination of positioning and patience that left Hale with no good options. The man was brought into Laramie, and the cattle were recovered, and Culver Marsh paid him the remainder of his fee with the particular satisfaction of a man who has gotten exactly what he paid for. Preston packed his saddlebags and rode to Thomas Ashfield's ranch on a January morning when the sky was the particular pale blue of a Wyoming winter that has temporarily relented, the kind of blue that looks like a promise even when you know better. Thomas Ashfield met him at the gate. Something in Thomas's expression suggested that he had been thinking about Preston Kirby's return and had opinions about it, and Preston could see those opinions forming into words that were going to come out whether or not they were welcomed. "Mr. Kirby," Thomas said, "I appreciate the help with the South Pasture business, but I should be direct with you." "All right," Preston said. "My sister-in-law is recently widowed," Thomas said. "She is in a vulnerable position and she is my responsibility. My brother would have expected me to look after her interests." Preston looked at him steadily. "I respect that. Do you have intentions?" Thomas asked, with the directness of a man who did not enjoy this conversation and wanted it finished quickly. "I have come to see her," Preston said. "That is all I can tell you honestly." Thomas studied him for a long moment with Daniel's pale eyes, and then he stepped aside. "She is in the kitchen," he said. Nora was in the kitchen. She was reading one of Daniel's books at the table, a cup of tea at her elbow and her dark hair pinned up in the practical, unself-conscious way of someone who does not expect visitors. And when she looked up and saw Preston in the doorway, she closed the book and put both her hands flat on the table, as though she needed the solidity of the surface. "You are back," she said. "I said I would be." She stood up. She crossed to the stove and took down another cup without asking and poured tea into it and handed it to him. He took it. Their fingers did not quite touch, but almost. They sat at the table and talked for 2 hours, and this time the conversation was different from the careful, sparse exchanges of the road, different from the charged silence of the ravine camp. They talked about things that mattered. About Daniel and about the brother Preston had lost, and about what it meant to survive the things that should have destroyed you. About Ohio and Missouri and what had brought them both to Wyoming in the end. She told him about the farm her father had managed and the schoolroom she had helped Daniel run, and the 2 years she had spent learning to read Latin simply because she had wanted to know if she could. He told her about cattle trails and the particular loneliness of open country, and the moment 4 years ago when he had understood that his brother was gone, and that the man responsible was someone he had called a friend. The name of that man was Elias Drummond, and saying it aloud for the first time in 4 years cost him something visible, something that crossed his face and stayed there, and Nora reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at her hand. He looked up at her. He did not speak. "What happened to him?" she asked. "Drummond. He went to prison," Preston said. "He is still there as far as I know." "Is that enough for you?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said, "but it is what there is." She squeezed his hand and let go, and he felt the loss of the contact like a temperature change. He began coming to the ranch regularly after that. It was a practical fiction at first. There were always legitimate reasons to pass through Thomas's property, routes to check and information to verify from his cattle theft work. And then Marsh offered him another job in the spring that kept him close to Laramie, and he discovered that the reasons mattered less than the fact of being there, which was its own reason. He was honest enough with himself about that, at least. Thomas watched this development with an expression that moved from disapproval to wariness to grudging resignation over the course of several weeks. And Nora navigated it with the careful, precise strategy of a woman who understood that she was dependent on Thomas's household and could not afford to antagonize him, but who was also, very fundamentally, her own person with her own desires and her own judgment. One evening in February, sitting with Preston by the fire in the small storage house turned room that was hers, with the cold outside pressing against the walls and the lamp turning everything amber, she told him the truth directly. "I think about you when you are not here," she said. "I thought about you for 2 months before you came back. I want you to know that I know what that means and I am not pretending I do not." Preston set down the cup he was holding. He looked at her with an expression that was the most open she had ever seen on his face, which was still not very open, but which contained something real and unguarded that she recognized as significant. "Nora," he said, "the first name, the weight of it." "I am not asking you for anything," she said. "I am simply telling you the truth because I think you are someone who prefers truth to pretense." "I do," he said, and he was quiet for a moment. "And I have been thinking about you too," he said, "since the road, since the fire." She let out a breath that she had not realized she was holding. "But I need to tell you something," he said, "about what I am, the kind of work I do, the kind of life I have had." His hands were resting on his knees, very still. "I have not been a good man by any straightforward measure. I have done things that were legal enough but that I am not proud of. The dark past that you could probably see on me from the beginning, it is real. It has not been altered or cleaned up by time." "I know that," she said. "You should not find that acceptable, Preston." She waited until he looked at her. "I am not 18 years old and naive about what men are. I am a grown woman who has buried a husband and crossed 3 states alone and sat in a frozen wagon on a dark road and accepted help from a stranger who built a fire without saying a word because it was the right thing to do." She held his gaze. "What I have seen of you is a man who does the right thing when it counts, even when it costs him something. I will not ask you to be more than you are, but I will also not let you persuade me to see less than I see." The silence that followed was enormous and full of things being settled. Then Preston Kirby, who had been alone for 4 years and had intended to be alone indefinitely, and had never in his 31 years on earth told anyone that he loved them, said, "I do not know how to do this." "Neither do I," she said. "I have only been in love with one person before, and he was nothing like you." "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "It is just true." He reached out and took her hand, deliberately this time, not as comfort but as declaration, his large, rough fingers closing around hers with a care that was almost reverent, as though he was afraid of getting the pressure wrong. "I would like to stay," he said, "if Thomas will permit it. In Laramie, close to here. Thomas will manage," she said. Thomas did, in fact, manage, though not without a conversation with Preston in the early spring that involved a significant amount of direct speaking on Thomas's part about duty and propriety and the reputation of women in small communities, and Preston listening to all of it with patience and then saying, simply, "I intend to do right by her, Mr. Ashfield. You have my word on that." Thomas had looked at him for a long time and then said, "You had better," which was the closest thing to a blessing either of them was going to get. The spring came in slowly and then all at once, the way Wyoming springs do, the snow retreating and the grass coming up in a sharp, impossible green, and the sky going from winter's flat gray to the deep, particular blue that makes you understand why people settled in this country, despite everything it asked of them. Preston finished Marsh's second job and found a third, and between the jobs he rode out to Thomas's ranch, and he and Nora walked in the mornings before the work of the day began, across the pasture and along the creek that ran along the property's south edge, talking. They talked about everything. She told him things about Daniel. She had not told anyone not sad things, but the specific, intimate things you only know about someone you have shared your life with. The small habits and preferences and private jokes that constitute the real biography of a person. She did not speak about Daniel as though he was a secret or as though his existence was a problem, and Preston found this honesty more affecting than he knew how to say. She had loved Daniel Ashfield, and Daniel Ashfield was gone, and she was now here in this field with him, and she held both things without contradiction. He told her about Missouri, about his father, who had been a drunk of the specific, miserable variety that turns outward rather than inward. Not violent, exactly, but corrosive. And the difference sometimes seemed academic when you were a child in the middle of it. About his mother, who had been strong and kind and had died when he was 15 of a fever, and whose absence had been the first great loss of his life, and had set a template for the ones that followed. About his brother James, who had been 2 years younger and sharper and brighter, and who had followed Preston west because he loved his brother, and because he wanted an adventure, and who had died for both of those reasons in a situation that could have been prevented if Preston had been paying attention, instead of trusting someone who was not worth trusting. Saying it all out loud in sequence, to someone who listened without flinching, was a different experience than carrying it. He had not expected the relief of it. One morning in late April, walking along the creek, he stopped walking and turned to her and said, without preamble or lead-up, "I love you." Nora stopped beside him. The creek was high with snowmelt and loud enough that the world beyond its banks seemed quieter by contrast, just them and the water and the pale spring sky. "I know," she said, and then she laughed a little at the directness of her own answer. "I mean, I love you too. I have known it for a while. I was waiting for you to catch up." He looked at her with an expression that was entirely new on his face, something that had the quality of dawn, slow, inevitable light coming into a place that had been dark a long time. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "There is a difference." "No," he said, "there is not." He kissed her then, by the creek in the April morning, and it was neither dramatic nor tentative, but something entirely itself. The specific, careful tenderness of a man who does not do things carelessly, and a woman who knows exactly what she wants and is allowing herself, for perhaps the first time in a very difficult year, to have it. The summer of 1879 was eventful. Preston proposed to Nora in June, not in a grand way but in a way that was entirely his. Directly, practically, with the same quality that everything he did had, of a decision made after careful thought and meant completely. He did it in the kitchen of her room at Thomas's ranch, with a ring he had bought in Laramie from a jeweler named Hallstrom, who had looked at Preston's dark coat and flat expression, and charged him slightly more than the standard price, and which Preston had paid without comment because the ring was simple and well made and suited her. She said yes before he had finished the question, which made him stop talking mid-sentence and look at her. "I am sorry," she said. "Finish your sentence." "I was asking if you would marry me." "Yes," she said again, with more ceremony this time, and then laughed. And he did something she had never seen him do before, which was laugh back. A short, real sound, slightly rusty with disuse. That was one of the most beautiful things she had ever heard. Thomas attended the wedding, which was held in Laramie in September at the small church near the center of town, conducted by a minister named Reverend Ellis, who had the brisk efficiency of a man who performed a great many weddings and had stopped being sentimental about them, but who could see, looking at these two people in front of him, that this was not a routine business and adjusted accordingly. Nora wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Helen had helped her choose, a blue that was the same color as the Wyoming sky on a clear winter day. And Preston wore his good coat, which he had cleaned and pressed for the occasion. And they stood in front of Reverend Ellis and said the words that bound them to each other in front of the law and God and Culver Marsh and Thomas Ashfield, who managed to look both moved and nervous about it at the same time. Preston had found property by then. A piece of land 5 miles from Laramie with a small house that needed significant work and enough acreage to run a modest operation, which he had bought with his savings and the money from Marsh's jobs, and which he had been working on through the summer until it was habitable, if not yet finished. They moved in the week after the wedding. The first night in the house, Nora walked through each room and named what she wanted to do with it. Not what she wished for abstractly, but specific practical things she could accomplish with available materials in realistic time frames, because she was Nora Ashfield, now Nora Kirby, and she did not dream without a plan attached. Preston followed her through the rooms and listened and occasionally said things like, "I can fix that beam before winter," or "There is enough pine in the south shed to build shelves." And it was one of the most intimate conversations of her life, because it was the conversation of people building something together, deliberately and carefully, and with full knowledge of what they were doing. That winter was quieter than the last one. Preston had reduced his range detective work significantly. Not because Nora had asked him to, she had not, but because the quality of what he wanted had shifted in ways that made the constant movement less appealing and less necessary. He took selective jobs, things that kept him within reasonable distance of home, and he began learning the rhythms of the land he owned with the same focused attention he had previously applied to reading landscapes for danger. Nora taught at the small school in Laramie 2 days a week, something that had emerged naturally from a conversation with the school's administrator about the shortage of teachers and her own background helping Daniel, and which she loved with a ferocity that surprised her. She was a good teacher, direct and patient and genuinely interested in the children as specific people, which they could tell, and which made the difference. She was also, she discovered in December, pregnant. She told Preston on a Sunday morning in the kitchen, the same kitchen where he had proposed 6 months earlier. And she told him directly because she had never in her life seen a point in indirect communication. And she watched his face go through a sequence of things: surprise, something that looked very close to fear, and then something else, something that settled into a kind of quiet, stunned joy that was entirely new on him, and that she wanted to hold on to and keep. He stood up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and went down on one knee beside her chair and took both her hands in his, which was the most purely emotional thing she had ever seen him do, and he said quietly, "Are you all right?" "I am wonderful," she said, and meant it. Their son was born in August of 1880, in the house on their land outside Laramie, with a midwife named Mrs. Caldwell presiding and Preston in the next room pacing in the particular manner of a man whose capability for action has been rendered irrelevant by circumstances, which was a kind of helplessness he had very little experience with and found extremely difficult. When Mrs. Caldwell opened the door and said, "Mr. Kirby, you have a son," Preston stood very still for a moment and then said, "Are they both well?" And when Mrs. Caldwell said yes, he sat down in the nearest chair and put his hands over his face for a moment. And no one was there to see it, which was probably how he would have wanted it. They named him James, which Nora had suggested, and Preston had not been able to speak his agreement for a moment when she did. James Kirby was born with his mother's gray eyes and his father's stubborn stillness. And he was, from the first day, exactly himself in the way that certain babies are, particular and present and utterly uninterested in performing expectations. Preston held him that first evening with the careful, precise attention of a man for whom physical tasks are usually a matter of training, and for whom this specific task had no training to fall back on. And Nora watched him figure it out with a tenderness so large it physically ached. "You can talk to him," she said. "He cannot talk back yet, but he can hear you." Preston looked down at the child in his arms and said, very quietly, "I will do better for you than was done for me. That is a promise." It was the most open thing she had ever heard him say, and she turned toward the window so he would not see her face. The years that followed were not uncomplicated. Preston's past had a way of occasionally manifesting in the present, as dark pasts tend to do, and there were moments of difficulty that they navigated together with the particular resilience of two people who had each independently survived terrible things, and understood that survival is not the same as brittleness. The most significant of those moments came in the spring of 1881, when a man rode onto their property and announced that Elias Drummond had been released from prison 6 months early on the grounds of good behavior, which was information that arrived in Preston's body like a blade. Nora was in the house when the man, a former sheriff's deputy named Calhoun who felt a duty to warn Preston, delivered this information on the porch. She heard it through the window and went very still over the bread she was kneading and said nothing and waited. When Calhoun rode away, Preston came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Nora and Nora looked at him, and James was asleep in the next room. "You heard," Preston said. "Yes. It is possible he will come here. It is possible he will not. He may simply have served his time and gone elsewhere." He was watching her face. "But you should know." "I know," she said. She wiped her hands on her apron. "What do you want to do?" He looked surprised by the question, which was its own kind of answer. He was still, at certain moments, caught off guard by being consulted rather than simply managed. "I want to stay here," he said. "I want to deal with it if it comes and go on if it does not. I am done running toward it." She nodded. "All right." He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her and put his hand on the side of her face, his large, careful hand against her cheek, and she leaned into it for a moment, and they were very quiet together. Elias Drummond did come. He came in late April on a gray morning when Preston was in the south pasture checking the fence line, and Nora was at the school in Laramie, which meant that James, who was 8 months old, was with Mrs. Caldwell in town, and the house was empty when a thin, weathered man with pale eyes and a way of standing that communicated menace without requiring any specific threat tied his horse at the post and knocked on the door of the Kirby house. When he got no answer, he left a note. The note said, simply, "You still owe me, Kirby, you know what for." Preston read it that evening, and his face did not change. But his eyes did something they rarely did, which was reveal something, not fear, but a recognition that had the quality of inevitability. The way you look at something you have been waiting for long enough that you are almost relieved it has finally arrived. "He was here," he told Nora. She read the note. "What does it mean? What does he think you owe him?" Preston sat down at the kitchen table and told her the full story of James's death in more detail than he had told anyone, including himself. The cattle operation he had been part of at 27, the money involved, the trust he had extended to Drummond because Drummond was older and more experienced, and because Preston had been, underneath the competence and the toughness, still young enough to believe that earning trust meant receiving it in return. The night James had been killed because he had seen something Drummond needed to remain unseen. The way Drummond had tried to claim that Preston had known, had been complicit, had owed him silence. He had not been complicit. He had not known. But Drummond had used the threat of implication to keep Preston quiet for 2 years, and Preston had carried that silence like a hidden infection, and it had cost him more than 2 years. "He has nothing," Nora said when he finished. "If he had something, he would have used it at his trial." "He has never operated on what is real," Preston said. "He operates on what people are afraid of." "Then we will not be afraid," she said. "We will be visible and consistent, and we will let him find nothing to use." He looked at her. "You are not worried." "I am furious," she said. "That is different from worried." They reported the visit to the sheriff in Laramie, a man named Holt who was competent and straightforward, and who took the note and agreed to keep an eye on Drummond's movements. Drummond came back once more, 3 weeks later, and this time Preston was in the yard when he arrived, and the confrontation that followed was not violent but was entirely clear, in the particular way of two people who understand each other's capacity, and are choosing, one of them for the first time, to make a different choice. "I do not owe you anything," Preston said. "I am done with the idea that I do. If you come onto my property again, I will involve the law and I will go through every detail of what happened 4 years ago with whoever needs to hear it. I have nothing to hide, and you have nothing left to threaten me with." Drummond looked at him for a long time with those pale, calculating eyes, and then he looked at the house and at Nora standing in the doorway and at the life that was visible in every part of it, and something shifted in his expression. Something that might have been, if you were being generous, a recognition that what he had come here for was gone, had become something he could not reach anymore. He left and did not return. Sheriff Holt reported 3 months later that Drummond had left Wyoming for Nevada, which was far enough away to be a different problem entirely and therefore, for the purposes of the Kirby household, not a problem at all. Preston was quiet for a day after hearing that news, the specific quiet of a man who has put something down that he has carried a very long time. And that evening he came inside, and he and Nora sat by the fire with James between them. James, who was now toddling around the house with the confident, slightly catastrophic energy of a child who has not yet learned that the world has edges, and Preston said, quietly, "I think it is over." "Yes," she said, "I think it is." He reached across and took her hand the way he had in the kitchen at Thomas's ranch, deliberately as declaration, and held it. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For all of it," he said. "For not flinching at any of it." "You are welcome," she said. "And the same." The house expanded in 1882. Thomas Ashfield visited in July of that year and stood on the porch and looked at the house and the land and James running in circles on the grass while the summer evening came in slow and golden, and he said, to Preston's back, "My brother would have liked you." Preston turned. He had not expected that. He looked at Thomas for a moment. "I hope so," he said. "He liked people who took things seriously," Thomas said. "He was that kind of man. Nora is that kind of woman. I think you are that kind of man as well." It was, from Thomas, an enormous thing to say, and they both understood that, and neither of them made anything more of it, which was exactly right. Nora was teaching full-time at the school by then, which had grown enough to require a second teacher, and which had, in the intervening years, become something she considered genuinely hers in a way that the small room at Thomas's ranch, and even their house, had taken time to become. The children of Laramie's families came in through the fall and winter, and she taught them reading and arithmetic, and the rudiments of geography, and whatever else they needed, with the directness and patience she brought to everything. And she was good at it in a way that had nothing to do with talent, and everything to do with the fact that she genuinely believed children were people worth taking seriously. Preston had gradually transitioned away from range detective work entirely by 1882, which was a transition he had made without drama but with thought. He had become, almost without noticing the shift, a man whose skills were more useful in service than in hire, and he had taken on a role as a deputy to Sheriff Holt, which suited his particular combination of abilities far better than it might have seemed. He was not a sociable man, which was sometimes a limitation in law work, but he was perceptive and patient and extraordinarily good at the parts of the job that required reading situations quickly and acting decisively. And Holt, who had worked with enough deputies to know a good one from a performance, valued him genuinely. The second pregnancy came in the spring of 1883, which Nora announced at the breakfast table one morning with the same directness she applied to everything. And Preston looked up from his coffee and said nothing for a moment and then said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but well." He got up and came around the table and kissed her on the top of her head, which was not the sort of thing he did often and which therefore meant more when he did it, and she caught his hand as he straightened up and held it for a moment. James, who was 2.5 years old and extremely vocal about his opinions on all subjects, looked up from his breakfast and said, "Papa, sit down." They both laughed. Their daughter was born in November of 1883, smaller than James had been and louder from the first moment, with Preston's dark eyes, and a way of looking at things that already, at a few hours old, had the quality of forming judgments. They named her Clara, which Nora had chosen because she liked the simplicity of it, and which Preston said suited her, and he held her in the same careful way he had held James, and said whatever he said to her in those first quiet hours that Nora did not hear because she was asleep, finally, from the work of it. James was fascinated by Clara in the specific, slightly suspicious way of older siblings confronted with the concrete reality of what they had been warned about, and spent the first 2 weeks of her life standing near her cradle and staring at her with the expression of a scientist who has not yet formed a hypothesis. Then she grabbed his finger one afternoon and held it with the iron grip that very young babies have, and James looked up at Preston with an expression of complete astonishment and said, "She is very strong, Papa." "Yes," Preston said, "she is." Preston had a way of looking at his children that Nora noticed and treasured without making much of to his face, because she knew he would deflect it if she named it directly. It was a specific quality of attention, the same quality he had given to the fire on the frozen road, to the fence line in the south pasture, to the details of cases that required careful reading. He paid attention to James and Clara in the way he paid attention to things that mattered, which was entirely and without distraction. And she had never, in her own childhood or in her marriage to Daniel, who had been loving but sometimes abstracted, seen a father give that quality of attention, and it moved her every time she saw it. She told him so, once, on an evening in the spring of 1884, when they were sitting on the porch after the children were asleep, and the night was warm enough to sit outside, and the sky was doing what Wyoming skies do in spring, which is put on an extravagance of stars that seems excessive and is not. "You are a remarkable father," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I do not always know what I am doing." "No one does," she said. "You pay attention, though, that is most of it." He reached over and took her hand, which he still did with the same deliberateness he had always had, as though touch were a decision rather than a reflex, which she had long since decided was one of the things she loved most about him. "I want them to have what James did not have," he said, meaning his brother, as he sometimes did when he said his son's name and paused after it. It had become a kind of settled thing, the way a wound that has healed properly settles, present but not raw, part of the landscape of him rather than a fresh injury. A person they can trust without it costing them. "They have that," she said. "They have 2 of those." He was quiet, looking at the stars. "Yes," he said, "I think they do." The summer of 1885 brought a drought that was hard on the whole county, and tested their carefully managed finances in ways that required adjustments and creativity, and more than one conversation at the kitchen table that went late into the night. Preston's deputy income was steady, which was its own kind of security, and Nora's teaching was consistent, and they had enough put by to manage the worst of it without disaster. But managing it required exactly the partnership they had built. The same attention to detail and honesty about numbers and willingness to make decisions together without the kind of pride that makes practical problems into personal ones. James started school that fall, Nora's school, which was an interesting situation that they had discussed and decided was fine, and which turned out to be, in practice, exactly fine, because Nora was constitutionally incapable of favoritism, and James was constitutionally incapable of expecting it, having correctly understood from an early age that his mother's affections and her professional standards were entirely separate things. Thomas Ashfield died that winter, quietly, in his sleep, which was the death he would have chosen, and which left his property to a nephew in Colorado and left Nora with a grief that was complicated by the fact that she and Thomas had never been simple with each other. She mourned him as she mourned most things, directly and without performance, allowing herself the specific weight of it and then, gradually, setting it down and continuing. Preston came home from the sheriff's office early on the day she got the news and did not ask her anything. Just came and sat beside her at the kitchen table and made coffee and stayed there. Which was, she thought, exactly what he had done on the frozen road in 1878, built the fire and stayed. Some people, she had come to understand, show love the same way across all the contexts of a life. Preston had been offered the sheriff's position when Holt retired in the spring, which he had thought about with the careful, deliberate consideration he brought to everything, and which he had accepted because the work was right, and the place was home, and the man who had drifted through a dozen territories looking for something he could not name had, without entirely meaning to, put down roots deep enough to hold. Nora had begun, alongside her teaching, to write. It started as letters, long, detailed letters to a woman she had met through Helen, who was compiling accounts of women's experiences in the Western Territories for a publication in Philadelphia, and which required her to think about her own experience with the kind of organized honesty she had always been capable of, but had never directed quite this way. She wrote about Ohio and Kansas, and the road and the wagon and the cold and the fire, and she wrote about arrival and beginning, and what it meant to build a life in a place that had not been built for you. She showed Preston the letters one evening and watched him read them with his characteristic stillness, his eyes moving through the pages with that focused quality that meant he was actually reading rather than performing reading. When he finished, he looked up. "You write well," he said. "You write the way you talk, directly. Is that a compliment?" "Yes," he said simply. She sent the letters. They were published in a collection that came out in 1887 alongside accounts from 15 other women across the territories. A copy arrived at the Laramie post office on a Thursday, and Nora brought it home and placed it on the kitchen table. And she and Preston and James, who was 7 and learning to take reading seriously, looked at it together. James opened the book to his mother's piece and read the first line aloud, slowly, sounding out the harder words. "I fell asleep in a cold wagon and woke up to a fire that should not have existed." He looked up at his mother. "That was you. That was me," she said, "and the fire was Papa." "Yes." James looked at Preston with the expression of a child revising an understanding. "You did not say anything." "No," Preston said. "Why not?" Preston thought about this. He had thought about it, over the years, in the way you occasionally look back at a moment that turned out to be foundational, and try to understand why you did what you did." He had not spoken because there had been nothing to say that the fire did not say better. Because some things are better demonstrated than announced. Because she had been asleep and frightened and cold, and what she needed was warmth, not conversation. And sometimes the most important thing you can do for a person is simply give them what they need before they have to ask for it. Because the fire was enough, he said. James considered this with the seriousness of a 7-year-old confronting a real answer to a real question. "But how did you know she would not be scared when she woke up?" "I did not know," Preston said. "I hoped." Nora was looking at him across the table over their son's head, and there was something in her expression that was simply love. Not the complicated, cautious thing it had been at the beginning, not the fierce, determined thing of the early years, but the settled, warm, and absolutely certain thing it had become over years of meals at this table and children in this house and fires built and work shared and truth told in both directions. "He stayed," she told James. "He built the fire and then he stayed until morning. That was how I knew." James looked between his parents with the calculating gray eyes he had inherited from his mother and the quiet, reading expression he had inherited from his father. "And then you got married," he said, with the slightly accusing tone of a child who finds adult romantic histories implausible. "Eventually," Nora said. "That is a long time." "Some things are worth taking the time on," Preston said. That evening, after James and Clara were in bed and the house was quiet, and the late spring night was warm enough that they could sit on the porch with the door open and listen to the specific silence of the Wyoming plain after dark. Nora leaned her head against Preston's shoulder, and he put his arm around her with the naturalness of long habit. "The fire was enough," she said, repeating his words to James, "but you staying was more." He was quiet for a moment. "I did not know what I was doing," he said. "I told you that at the beginning. You know now." "Some of it," he said, which was as close to contentment as a man like Preston Kirby came, and which was, she had learned, more than enough. The stars were out. The prairie was vast and dark and full of all the country that had been here before them and would be hereafter, indifferent to the particular lives lived on it but present for all of them, the background against which the foreground happened. A wagon on a frozen road. A man who turned his horse around. A fire built in silence. Everything that followed. Nora thought about Daniel sometimes, still, always with love, always with the specific grief of things that end too soon, but also with a kind of gratitude that she had come to understand was not disloyal. He had pressed the revolver into her hand. He had written the letter to Thomas. He had been, in his quiet and particular way, pointing her toward a life he could not be part of. And she thought that he would have recognized Preston Kirby on sight as a man who was worth the trust she had given him, which was the highest thing she could say about either of them. Clara called out from inside, one of her brief, declarative cries that were not distress but announcement, the sound of a child processing the world behind closed eyes. Preston shifted to stand. "I will go," Nora said. She went in and settled Clara and came back out and sat beside her husband again on the porch they had built together in the summer of 1882. In the house they had built together from the materials of their separate wreckage. And the night was warm, and the stars were immense, and the life around her had the specific, unspectacular perfection of things that are exactly what they are meant to be. "You know," she said, "I wrote in those letters about waking up to the fire, but I did not write about the sharpening, the whetstone." "No," he agreed. "It was the most frightening and most reassuring thing at the same time," she said. "A man with a knife sitting there not looking at me. I could not decide whether to be terrified or not." "Were you terrified?" "A little," she said, "but mostly I was curious." He turned to look at her, and in the lamplight that came through the open door, she could see his face as she had come to know it over 7 years. The lines that had deepened, and the eyes that had slowly, gradually, over the course of a great many mornings and evenings and truths told across a kitchen table, given up their opacity. Not completely. He was still, and would always be, a man who kept a great deal inside himself. But she could read him now the way she had learned to read the Wyoming sky, not always able to predict exactly what was coming, but always able to understand what was already here. Curious about what? He asked. About you, she said. I thought, there is a man with a very long story and I am alive to wonder about it because of him, and I would very much like to know what the story is. He was quiet for a moment. And now you know it. Most of it, she said. You still surprise me sometimes. Is that a problem? She laughed, which was a sound she made more often than she ever had before this life, because she was happy in the straightforward, real way that is not dramatic but is everything. No, she said, the echo of an earlier answer between them. It is just true. The fire had been enough to save her life. The staying had been the beginning of everything else. And everything else, it turned out, was more than either of them had known how to hope for in that cold, first night. More rooms and more seasons and more conversations and 2 children with gray eyes and dark eyes and loud opinions and questions that required real answers. And a porch and a school and a book on a shelf with a sentence on the first page that a boy of 7 read aloud on a Thursday afternoon and understood, even at 7, was a love story. It was. It had always been. From the moment the fire existed when it should not have existed, in the cold dark on a road to nowhere that turned out to be a road to here.